Hey, yo, Rod.
Hey, yo, Eric.
So glad to have you on the second mini episode. We're going to dive right into MMA head first. But before we do, just wanted to get a little preview, I suppose, of the next A Few Words podcast, because someone that you and I know very well, the audience might not know well. We've mentioned him a few times in previous episodes, but your childhood friend, Brian Coppola, will be my guest. We've been friends a long time, and you were his best man when he got married almost 2 years ago, believe it or not. So let us know what we can expect from this one-on-one.
I definitely have known Brian since 92, and it was one of those things where we became best friends pretty much instantly. Like, you know, we hung out, and after that, every day we just hung out, and I probably wouldn't have the vision or the production background or even the idea that I wanted to be in production if it wasn't for him. We kind of started like making movies together and everything else. He was really like my right-hand man for a lot of the films I made when we were younger. So, yeah, I think the fans are going to expect some interesting talk, some good convo, and some good insight from him.
You've described the dynamic between you and he in the past as similar to the dynamic between Lawrence and myself, where we were very tight collaborators on a lot of the projects that we worked on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We would do a lot of brainstorming together, even for my own films. Like, I would run stuff by with him, and he would definitely, like, keep me in check or, like, kind of enhance the idea, or if he thought that, like, we could do something better. I was always acceptable to his ideas. If I was dealing with one actor, he will deal with the other people. Great co-director, very great co-director. He did all the camera work for the It Girl, so it really helped having him there.
And the It Girl was a movie that you had made that you submitted to festivals. And Brian and I, you mentioned collaboration. He was someone that I consulted with when starting this podcast. We had talked about doing an audio show or podcast many times over the years, and that's why I thanked him in the first episode. So he's now the 10th. The first guest through Skype, and
Nice.
That's what we're doing this mini podcast on right now. So let's get right into it. I was in Vegas.
Many about this podcast, Eric.
That's right, especially with the biggest show on paper supposedly ever. And I was in Vegas for UFC 200. I did a blog while I was out there. I think it was a nice companion piece in many ways to the first UFC blog that I did, which was number 4 for UFC 100 back in 2009. And now here in 2016, 10 video blogs later, we're doing UFC 200. And I gave my thoughts on a lot of the fights then, so I'd like to hear some of yours. I know you saw the last 2 fights in particular. So I had already given my thoughts on most of the card at this point, but I just wanted to make one more and consolidate really the Daniel Cormier Anderson Silva fight along with the Brock Lesnar Mark Hunt fight, because in my mind anyway, UFC 200, I said on the blog, may not have lived up to the hype as 100 did, and I could see that in a way because 100 had the great moments of the Dan Henderson knockout on Michael Bisping, one of the best ever, and we're going to get the rematch in England hopefully soon later this year, so that's cool. And of course, Brock smashing Frank Mir in the main event. George St. Pierre, round after round, taking Thiago Alves down at will. So there were a lot of great moments, and I thought it would be very poetic that John Jones in the prelims for UFC 100 would headline 200, but that was not to be. As it was, Daniel Cormier ended up fighting Anderson Silva, who, especially after this performance, granted it was on a day's notice, but like I said on the blog, I feel like this fight would have gone the same way, training, prepared or not. Anderson Silva just hasn't been the same since he lost the championship. And for Daniel Cormier and Brock, there really wasn't any other way for them to win this fight. They had to take these strikers down. I understand people boo. I don't really get people disliking Daniel Cormier, especially in this whole situation. I thought how he is the heel, the villain, I don't get it. But if you're going to boo Daniel Cormier for not finishing Anderson Silva and winning a boring style, fine. But what about the guys on the bottom? It's their job to get up from that. If someone's laying on top of you and you know from grappling and doing your training, it's your job to get out from underneath that. You can't just let someone lay on top of you. As difficult as that might be when you're fighting gravity and hundreds of pounds on top of you, you still have to get out. And that's what Joanna Jędrzejczyk did, which I thought was the fight of the weekend, frankly, the main event of Ultimate Fighter finale against Claudia Gadelha, which was a great fight. And that's exactly what she did. She got taken down for 2 rounds, and then the last 3, she struck the hell out of her, and everyone loved that. So what do you think about the style, especially with your wrestling background that we talked about on the podcast, that Brock and Cormier utilized and those 2 fights?
Well, I think it's very different because what people have to understand is that, first of all, when she was getting taken down, she did very little to stop a lot of the takedowns in the first 2 rounds. And then, yes, like when Claudia started getting a little bit more tired, even exhausted as Claudia was, she was still able to land 1 or 2 takedowns. And Joanna did a good job of getting back up. But the difference is you want to train to fight Claudia. Silva didn't do any training, took this fight on 2 days' notice. And when you have an Olympic caliber wrestler on top of you in pinning position, it's a whole different level. And someone who is much bigger, someone who has won and is undefeated at heavyweight, fighting a middleweight. So I think that would be very tough to overcome. And for Cormier, he's not going to sit there and risk standing up with Anderson Silva. He didn't have to take this fight. He fought to make money, to still be on the card, and, to kind of give the fans who came to see him the chance to see him fight. It kind of sucks because when you look at it on paper, like, holy shit, Daniel Cormier versus Anderson Silva, it should have been a lot bigger.
Not even that one, but just the fact, like the day before, I was saying, I'm about to see Brock Lesnar, Anderson Silva, and Miesha Tate all on the same card tomorrow. That's insane. On paper, it was a great card.
Unbelievable. And as far as hype goes, to make comparisons to UFC 100 and UFC 200, no one has mentioned that the main event for UFC 100 was originally supposed to be the main event of UFC 98.
Right.
It wasn't like they had these huge plans. I mean, going up for UFC 200, some people had these ridiculous fucking cards as if it was going to be the last UFC event ever. It was like Cyborg and Rousey and McGregor and Frankie, GSP and Anderson Silva, and fucking, I don't know, Brock Lesnar coming back. And, like, really, bro? Like, you gotta be realistic. Like, yes, it's a big event, but I thought they put on a lot more than they needed to. Yeah, it was great, but fans still weren't happy with the card itself before. It was pretty ridiculous considering who was on the undercard. As far as Brock goes and, like, his style, I think people kind of expected that. That's his style. People kind of give heavyweights a little bit more leeway. Brock isn't exactly a stand-up fighter, so he already said this is a grappler versus striker match, and this is what it was built as. And Brock went out there, got the perfect game plan, and really looked very good, really good.
Brock has been a headliner recently in the news because of his drug test failure. USADA popped him for, what was it? I know they tested him a whole handful of times, but it was
estrogen blockers.
Yes, for the pre-fight and the post-fight. That was something you were really railing against in text to me, that you're really sick of this USADA shit. So in light of what happened with John Jones and this Chad Mendes just getting suspended recently for 2 years, explain to me why you think, I'm guessing, gauging from your text, that everyone should just be allowed to do whatever drugs they want.
Because they're ruining my life, Eric. They're ruining my life. Maybe it's me. I'm the guy who likes to see everyone hit home runs instead of line drives to second base. I'm the guy who likes to see these guys make the card, put on great fights, and, just be athletic specimens out there. People have to understand what a physically demanding sport MMA is, and you're doing it for nothing, and you're training harder, if not as hard, as pro athletes in other sports.
But that excuses cheating and using drugs.
Is it cheating if you don't know you're cheating?
So is this the tainted substance excuse? I didn't know what was in it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, like, when you're on that level, when you're getting paid to fight, and you know that there's like an Olympic level drug testing policy, I think that you should be very careful and look at everything in the label. I mean, I've heard Chael Sonnen talk about him trying to send over supplements to USADA, and they won't tell him if it's okay or not. Are you trying to fail people? Like, what's going on? I think USADA could do a better job in educating fighters, because it feels like a lot of these fighters are getting popped and it's catching them off guard. And instead of like fighting it and going to court and possibly losing out on more money, they just, eat it and accept it.
Coming full circle again with Brock, after 100, which I was also out in Vegas for, of course, I remember calling home and my dad saying that he had heard, he wasn't a fight fan or anything. He'd watch it here and there if I was watching it. But I remember him saying, this Brock guy, I hear he's going to fight a Russian. And even before Brock got in the cage this time again, it's funny how he left wrestling and MMA and came back to both in that order. But again, this time with Fedor fighting on Fight Pass recently in Russia against Fabio Maldonado, which was horrid, people were talking about Fedor in the conversation. Could Fedor and Brock fight at MSG? Obviously, Brock's future is very much in doubt now, up in the air. But even so, I think if a deal would have been able to be reached, and it's funny that that fight originally was set, they wanted to do it in Cowboy Stadium. And what did we end up when Brock ended up finally performing there? Dean Ambrose. But
Oh, Christ. At least he won.
yeah, right. But I think if Fedor got in the ring with Brock today, he would get destroyed. It wouldn't even be a contest. I'd still love to see it, of course, in a freak show Bellator type way, because it is Fedor finally stepping foot in the UFC. But that's going to lead to a question from one of our listeners, John White, who asked us, how do you think Fedor, if he was in his prime, like let's say Pride version Fedor, how would he do in the UFC today with the division they have?
I think this Fedor would be a top 10 heavyweight. I think he could make his way to a title, but I think there are certain guys who wouldn't get past. I don't think he gets past Cain Velasquez, Junior Dos Santos.
For Doom, again.
Verdum, he has a puncher's chance. Stipe would be a challenge, but Fedor, I think in his heyday, was very slick on the ground. I think he was way ahead of his time as far as like the hybrid, fast-moving heavyweight. He was a lot smaller. I think he'd have to drop down to 205.
That's possible, and I think Fedor from 10 years ago or whatever would be in the top 10, like you said, but Fedor today would just get annihilated. It wouldn't even be close. But that's going to lead us into the main event, and I covered it on the blog, which was my disappointment in Cupcake Misha Tate losing her title in her first defense, this hot potato of a title, to Amanda Nunes. And the only other thing I wanted to add to it was you and I talk all the time when we compare MMA and pro wrestling. What did Lawrence and I talk about for basically the entire first mini episode? WWE just doesn't go full bore making new stars. Whereas you and I talk all the time about there's constantly new stars being made. I remember years ago, people were crying about when Anderson Silva got hurt and GSP retired. Oh my God, the star power's gone. Who's going to fill the gap that they did and Brock left and blah, blah, blah. Well, we saw Ronda rise. We saw Conor still a draw. And there's constantly churning out new stars. You talk about all the time about some of these cards, basically like a C-level show, and they end up having some good fights. And even 201 this past...
Oh my God, that's insane.
Yeah, and even 201, I remember on MMA Insiders, they joked that it was UFC giving the pay-per-view buying audience a month off before the Conor Diaz rematch. But the card ended up being great. And I know, obviously, the more marketable fight is Misha Ronda 3 or Misha Holly 2, Holly Ronda 2, whatever you want to say. But at the same time, I know they just announced the return to Brazil. It's a fight night, so I don't know if Amanda Nunes might defend her title against Juliana Pena there. Apparently, of course, Rousey gets dibs at the title whenever she wants to come back, but with that not in sight, Juliana Pena seems to be the next one in line. So I think her headlining in a title fight in Brazil would be great. But again, how could you not consider, forget the fact that she's Brazilian, and we all know Brazilians have to have a champion in UFC. There's two right now, I believe. But how could you not consider having the first openly gay champion in UFC in a basically what I consider hot women's division, a potential star or something that's marketable?
Yeah, and not only that, but she's the first women's Brazilian UFC champion.
Right.
So I think that like says a lot right there. I was really happy for Amanda Nunes. I definitely didn't see the fight going that way. When I saw Amanda Nunes choke out Sarah McMahon, I knew that this girl was on the rise. And it's only a matter of time before she got a title shot, because it did not look like the same woman who got stopped by Kat Zingano. No. So I thought that Misha was eventually going to take it. I knew that Nunes was going to give her some trouble. A good win for her, obviously. Definitely catapulted her, but I think because at that time she wasn't as well known as a lot of the other fighters on the card, it kind of felt very anticlimactic. You know, you have a fight that was for weeks built up as at first a co-main event, and then the third fight in the card, and then now 2 days before, this is like, you know, after you've seen Brock and Anderson Silva and Frankie and Aldo and Cain Velasquez, and then you get this women's fight where it's like, yes, you have Misha Tate, who beat the girl.
Right.
She loses, and it's kind of, I don't know, it just felt very anticlimactic, I felt like. But for her to say that she won in the main event of UFC 200, hey, good for her. And it just shows that, especially since Razzie has been in the division, the women's bantamweight division is so much more interesting now. It's a lot more competitive. I'd like to see how Razzie would do against like some of these girls, how she would do against Nunes, how she would do against Pena, and these girls rising to the top. It's funny that like both Holly Holm and Misha Tate each lost to the girls who are on the undercard of the championship fight.
Well, it's also funny, walking out of the T-Mobile Arena, I was thinking, this is the second card that I've seen Misha and Anderson fight on, and they both lost.
Oh, yeah, because you're at 168, right?
That's right. And
oh, wow.
You mentioned Ronda, who seems to only be making commercials anymore. But the Cyborg fight that people had wanted for years is going to lead me into another question John White submitted, because it's interesting. You just mentioned the division basically being wide open now, where it was a one-woman show before. And people kept saying the division isn't deep enough.
Oh, come on. They say that about everything.
They do, but from my, let's say, more educated eye, I was thinking, well, no other women's fights end in 14 seconds like they do with Ronda. They are very competitive against each other. Ronda just trounces them. And until she got in there with someone who figured out her style, who really matched up, what's the saying we constantly hear in regards to the women's division? Styles make fights. And when Holly used her kickboxing and totally outclassed Ronda, now the division's wide open and no one can hold on to the title. That's going to lead into the question, like I said, that John White had. Can anyone beat Cyborg? You and I were just watching that top 200 list that was on Fox Sports 1. Cyborg was actually on it because all you had to do was fight in UFC once, and this was a very good list. It was truer than they have been in the past. Frank Shamrock got his due. Pat Miletich got his due. A lot of people.
Frank Shamrock was pretty high in the list.
Yeah, and a lot of people got their due that haven't in the past. I was glad Tank Abbott came in at 200. He just made the cut. But Cyborg was on the list. She's only fought once in UFC, but that's taking into consideration her career. So being that Holly and Misha were making it out like, yeah, we're open to a Cyborg fight. I don't know about you, but after seeing what Holly did to Ronda, I keep thinking if Cyborg did fight Ronda, it would go just like that. So do you think anybody could beat her?
I think she can be beaten. I'm just not sure who. I mean, at first when the whole Ronda Cyborg fight started, I thought, okay, Ronda doesn't have a shot. And then after Ronda's fight at 175, when she beat Alexis Davis in 16 seconds, I think that's when I started changing my mind. I'm like, oh, all right, this girl is pretty fucking badass. What she did to Kat Zingano after and everything like that. Betch Correia, I mean, I don't know. I didn't think Betch had a chance. I think Betch lasted a lot longer than she did. But I understand why they did that fight. I think Ronda still has a chance. She would really have to improve her stand-up for her to have a chance. I mean, improve her stand. I mean, even in her fights where she like won in under a minute, she still got hit.
Right.
You can't risk that against Cyborg. I think Holly and Cyborg would be interesting because the key with Holly and Ronda was that Ronda was moving forward the whole time, and Holly's not an aggressive fighter. She's a very good counter striker, and she really took advantage of Rousey's aggressiveness. If she could do the same to Cyborg, I think she could beat her. I could see Cyborg getting submitted. I can't see her getting knocked out.
Even with a black belt in jiu-jitsu?
Yeah. When she fought Gina Carano, like, people don't realize this is a much more competitive fight than it was. Like, Gina Carano had her in mount at one point, you know? That was still one of my, like, all-time, like, favorite women's fights ever. Gina Carano had her in mount, so I think it's possible.
Well, that's going to lead us into the last UFC pay-per-view, which was this past Saturday, and some big events at the top. We had Jake Ellenberger basically fighting for his career against Matt Brown, and that started a trend that continued in the main event, which was guys who are known for their wars, for going out there and throwing down Matt Brown and Robbie Lawler, getting knocked out in the first round. So Ellenberger basically saved his job and popped the crowd. How'd you like it?
Holy shit. I loved it. You know, I like Ellenberger. I didn't see this coming. And it made me mad that I didn't bet on these fights.
and that's another fight that you look at those names on paper and you're like, oh, that's going to be a good one.
And it's just like, especially this year, like we always said, like MMA is unpredictable. And that's what I love about the sport so much, where now there's some fights, okay, you can predict, but there are some fights where you just did not see coming at all. And this was one of them. Like if you told me that Jake Ellenberger finished Matt Brown in the first round. Like, Matt Brown, not too long ago, was fighting Robbie Lawler for the #1 contender spot. Mm-hmm. And Jake, that's a huge win for Ellenberger. And we'll see where he goes from here, because this guy was on the come-up for a while. So if he can continue, then I think it's going to deepen the division.
Another exciting division to me is the strawweights. The women seem to usually bring it. They've got a great batting average. And now Karolina Kowalkiewicz looks like she's going to challenge Joanna Jędrzejczyk, her countrywoman, her fellow Polish fighter, as she got a win over Rose Namajunas. Joanna wants to do this in New York and MSG. She had said that after the Ultimate Fighter finale, and Karolina had said the same thing, I'll fight her in New York, but Dana White wants to do this in Poland, and as someone who's half Polish myself, I would love to see that in maybe even a stadium in Poland. I mean, Joanna was the co-main for the largest crowd they ever had in Australia with Holly and Ronda, so imagine what that is going to be like if two Polish fighters fight for the strawweight title in Poland. I just love the styles in this fight, this Muay Thai stand-up. What'd you think of her win over Rose Namajunas?
Well deserved. I think Rose had the first round, Karolina had the second round, so it's all about that third round.
Right.
Eventually, Rose started getting a little tired from what I saw, and Karolina took advantage. And boy, I remember first time seeing her and being like, man, this girl is pretty good. I didn't think Rose even had to take this fight. I think with her wins over Paige and I think her win over Tisha Torres, she could have been next. I was expecting her to be next for Joanna, to be honest. But hey, man, I'm happy for her. Rose took it like a champ. I'm excited to see that. If Karolina fights Joanna, though, I don't see her being as competitive. I think Joanna just is a lot quicker. Her takedown defense is, very good. She's just vicious with elbows. I think overall her striking is just a little bit more crisp.
And lastly, Rodney, we move on to the main event, the welterweight title. Changes hands as Tyrone Woodley knocks out Robbie Lawler. I did a tweet January 2nd, joking, half joking, I should say, because it really will probably end up being fight of the year. Who knows? I said that Condit and Lawler fight was fight of the year already. Lawler, like I said, has been a guy known for going the distance in these wars where he gives everything to the point of exhaustion, where he practically collapses afterwards, and that's what we love about him, that fighting spirit. But bam, knocked out in the first round. I had a feeling Tyrone might do that. What'd you think of the main event?
I think I was in the minority of people who actually thought that Tyron Woodley did deserve this title shot, considering what happened at UFC 192 with Hendricks not making weight, which sucked because I think two wrestlers who are good at striking. I was pretty excited to see that fight. It was good to see UFC kind of keep their promise and give this guy a title shot for training and not having the other guy, show up correct. I was going for Lawler, but I also had a feeling that Woodley would do the job just because he's a lot more athletic and a lot more powerful. He's shown knockout power in his fights with Koscheck and Dong and Kim. As soon as he got on the microphone, I think I lost respect for him.
Why is that? Is it calling out a fight for Nick Diaz, a guy who hasn't won a fight in 5 years, is going to get a title shot, apparently?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, who the hell are you? I don't know. He just showed himself out to be like this big nerd because he won the belt. Now he wants some money fights. I mean, come on. I mean, yeah, exactly. Calling out Nick Diaz, the guy who hasn't won, since fighting a lightweight BJ Penn, calling out GSP, okay, I get that. That was a good move. When George St. Pierre won the belt, he didn't say, I want big fights. What he did was he beat people so that then every fight he's in is a money fight. That's what you have to do as a champion. Take on all comers, show that you're the guy, and then have people call you out. So then all of a sudden, every fight that you're in is the money fight. That's how you do it. Because fighting Nick Diaz isn't going to make Tyron Woodley any cooler. Sure, he could get like a big payday fighting someone with no wrestling and does horrible against wrestlers. My prediction is he's not going to fight either of them. That it's going to be him and Wonderboy, and I hope Wonderboy kicks his head off.
That would be cool for Stephen Thompson. But if GSP finally decides to come back, you know that he's going to take a back seat because from my way of thinking, if it is Aldo McGregor 2 headlining Madison Square Garden, Tyrone and GSP would be a perfect co-main.
But I don't know if GSP wants to fight for the belt right away.
I don't think he does, but you would think it would make sense.
I think, with his time away, and being a champion for so long and, like, having to deal with the media and, like, it exhausts you. I don't think he wants to go to that championship lifestyle right away. I think he wants to get in there, maybe fight, like, a few, big-name fights because, honestly, he hasn't had that since BJ Penn at UFC 94, like kind of like that mega fight. And if anyone deserves that, it's GSP. If I was GSP, I would say, Tyron, thanks but no thanks, but show me that you're a champion.
Tyrone, I'm not impressed by your performance.
Yeah, I'm not impressed.
I hope you've been impressed with this mini episode. It's been great talking UFC with you, Rodney, and let's do it again soon.
Hey, man, always. I'm here for you, bro.
And don't forget to tune in to A Few Words every week. Subscribe on SoundCloud, iTunes, give us a like on Facebook, a follow on Twitter, all that good stuff.